The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything that day in '78, on the sweat-slicked brow of the preacher, on the brim of Bartholomew Higgins's fine black hat, and on the pristine white lace of Loretta May Parker's wedding dress. She stood before the makeshift altar, a mail-order bride trading her lonely past for a prosperous, if uncertain, future. The preacher's words droned on a meaningless hum beneath the pounding of her own heart. But just as he reached the part about speaking now or forever holding one's peace, a shadow fell across them all. A lone rider, a Comanche, sat on his war pony at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't there for blood. He was there for her, and what he said next would shatter the silence of the prairie and ignite a fire that would consume them all. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Texas panhandle, beating down on the raw, unpainted wood of the Redemption Gulch Town Hall. Inside, it was stifling. Loretta May Parker felt a single bead of sweat trace a path from her temple down her cheek, a tear of heat and nerves. She kept her eyes fixed on the preacher, a man named Reverend Michael O'Connell, whose face was as red and mottled as a boiled ham. To her right stood Bartholomew Bart Higgins, the man who had paid her passage from a desolate orphanage in St. Louis. He was the town's undisputed king-owner of the largest cattle ranch, the saloon, and the will of most men in it. He smelled of whiskey leather and an unnerving sort of ownership. Loretta clutched the small bouquet of prairie wildflowers so tightly her knuckles were white. This was it. The end of one lonely road and the beginning of another. She didn't love Bart Higgins. She hardly knew him. But love was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. Security was the currency that mattered, and Higgins had it in spades. And do you, Bartholomew, take this woman, Loretta May, to be your lawfully wedded wife? The Reverend boomed his voice, echoing in the tense silence. I do, Bart said, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. He squeezed her arm, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt more like a brand. And do you, Loretta May? The preacher never finished the question. The heavy oak doors of the town hall swung open with a groan, flooding the room with blinding sunlight. A figure stood silhouetted against the glare, tall and imposing. As the crowd's eyes adjusted, a collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. He was Comanche. There was no mistaking the buckskin leggings, the bare, muscled chest, adorned with a simple bone breastplate, or the two stark eagle feathers tied into his long black hair. His face was a mask of hard lines and sun-baked leather, but his eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the room with an intensity that silenced every whisper. He was alone, his paint horse standing patiently behind him, but he carried the presence of a whole war party. Bart Higgins turned his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. What in the hell is this Sheriff Peterson? Get this savage out of my wedding. Sheriff Peterson, a portly man with a drooping mustache, nervously reached for his pistol, but the Comanche warrior's gaze flickered to him for a fraction of a second, and the sheriff's hand froze. The warrior dismounted and walked slowly, deliberately into the hall. His moccasins made no sound on the dusty floorboards. He ignored Bart, ignored the terrified faces of the townspeople. His eyes found Loretta, and they held her fast. It was a look she didn't understand, a look that spoke of vast, empty plains, and a hunger that went deeper than flesh. He stopped a few feet from the altar. The air was thick enough to choke on. He looked at her truly, looked at her from the cheap lace on her dress to the fear in her pale blue eyes. A deep, guttural sound, something between a sigh and a groan, escaped his lips. He spoke his voice rough from disuse, the English words heavy with a native accent, yet clear and resonant in the silent room. I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. he said, his voice raw with a decade of solitude and grief. The statement hung in the air, bizarre and inexplicable. 10 years. It was an eternity in this unforgiving land. Before anyone could process the strangeness of the declaration, he moved. In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between them. He bypassed the sputtering Bart Higgins as if he were a piece of furniture. He cupped Loretta's face in his calloused hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle or romantic kiss. It was desperate, frantic, a starving man's first taste of water. It was a kiss of recognition, of reclamation, of a pain so profound she could taste it on his lips, the salt of tears shed long ago. The wildflowers fell from her hands, scattering at their feet. The room exploded. Bart Higgins roared like a wounded bear lunging forward, but the Comanche was faster. He broke the kiss, keeping one arm firmly around Loretta's waist, pulling her against his hard frame. With his free hand, he drew a long, gleaming knife from a sheath at his back. The blade caught the light, a sliver of deadly steel that stopped everyone in their tracks. "She is not yours," the warrior said, his dark eyes boring into Bart's. "She is Numunu. The people. You're insane." Bart spat, his face purple with fury. "She's my wife." The Comanche warrior looked down at the terrified, bewildered woman in his arms. He ignored Bart's claim entirely. His next words were not to the room, but to her, a pronouncement that was also a vow. "We are married now. In the eyes of the Great Spirit, you are my wife." And with that, he began to pull her stumbling towards the open door, towards the blinding sun, and the unknown world that lay beyond Redemption Gulch. Chaos erupted, like a flash flood. Men shouted, women shrieked, and Sheriff Peterson finally found his courage, his Colt Peacemaker clearing its holster with a metallic scrape. "Hold it right there, Injun. Let the girl go," he yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and duty. The Comanche warrior Tavibo did not stop. He moved with a liquid grace, pulling Loretta along with him. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. Who was this man? What did he mean? Married, his grip was like iron, yet it wasn't cruel. It was possessive, absolute. As they reached the doorway, a second and then a third, Comanche rider appeared, materializing from the shimmering heat, as if from the earth itself. They were younger, their faces painted for a fight, and they carried rifles with a casual deadliness. The townspeople who had begun to surge forward behind Bart Higgins skidded to a halt. 1 lone warrior was a curiosity. 3 were an invasion. "Shoot them!" Higgins bellowed, his face a mask of apoplectic fury. "Shoot them down like the dogs they are." But no one fired. To shoot was to start a war they were not prepared to fight. Redemption. Gulch was isolated, a tiny speck of civilization in a vast, untamed wilderness. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Tavibo swung Loretta up onto his horse with an ease that belied her weight. She landed awkwardly in front of him, her white wedding dress a stark and ridiculous flag against the horse's sweating hide. He vaulted up behind her, his arm a steel band around her waist. "Loretta, for God's sake, fight him!" Bart screamed, his voice raw with desperation. He saw his prize, his property being stolen in broad daylight. Loretta struggled, pushing against the warrior's chest. "Let me go. Please, I don't know you." Tavibo leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. His voice, a low, urgent murmur, meant only for her. "They gave you a new name, but I know who you are. I have always known." He reached into a small leather pouch tied to his belt and pulled out a small object. He pressed it into her hand. Loretta's fingers closed around it instinctively. It was wood, worn smooth with age and touch. She didn't dare look at it, not yet. Tell me what they call you," he demanded, his voice softer now. "Loretta? Loretta May Parker." She stammered, tears streaming down her face. A flicker of pain crossed his features. "No," he said, his voice firm. "That is the name of a ghost. Your name is carried on the wind. Your name is Lily Ann." The name struck her like a physical blow. Lily Ann. It was a ghost of a name, a whisper from a part of her life. She couldn't access a locked room in the back of her mind. The headaches that had plagued her for years, the disjointed nightmares of fire and screaming, they all seemed to coalesce around that name. The orphanage matrons had told her she was found wandering near a burned-out wagon train, a mute and traumatized child of 5 or 6. They named her Loretta because she couldn't tell them her own name. "How?" she whispered, her struggle ceasing for a moment. "How do you know that name?" Before he could answer, Bart Higgins made his move. Consumed by a prideful rage, he charged forward, grabbing the horse's bridle. "I'll see you in hell before you take what's mine." One of Tavibo's companions raised his rifle, but Tavibo gave a sharp command in his own tongue. He would handle this himself. With his knife still in hand, he leaned over, and with a single precise movement, slashed the leather reins. Higgins stumbled back, clutching the useless straps of leather. Tavibo spurred his horse. The animal leaped forward, scattering the crowd. As they galloped out of the small town, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in their wake, Loretta risked a glance back. She saw Bart Higgins standing in the middle of the street, his face a portrait of utter humiliation and hatred. He was screaming, but the words were lost to the wind. His vow of vengeance, however, was written plainly in his eyes. The sun beat down as they rode the 2 other warriors flanking them. The town of Redemption Gulch shrank behind them until it was nothing more than a smudge on the horizon. Loretta was alone, captive, being carried deeper into a wilderness she had only ever seen from a train window. Her mind raced. 10 years. He had said he hadn't seen a woman in 10 years. Lily Ann. He knew her real name, the object in her hand. She slowly opened her fist. It was a small, crudely carved bird, a meadowlark, its head tilted as if in song. The wood was dark and polished by the touch of 1,000 thumbs, and as she looked at it, a memory sharp and painful as a shard of glass pierced the fog in her mind. A little boy with laughing eyes pressing a freshly carved bird into her hand. A pine forest, the smell of wood smoke. A voice, not her own, saying a name. Kowotsi. Wolf cub. She looked up at the hard profile of the man who held her. His face was no longer that of a boy, but the grief and determination in his eyes were the same. The world tilted on its axis. The man the world called Tavibo, the fearsome Comanche warrior, was the little boy from her shattered past, and he had just stolen her from her own wedding. The ride was a brutal, jarring affair. Tavibo pushed his horse hard, navigating the broken terrain with an instinct that seemed more animal than human. They left the dusty plains and entered a landscape of rocky mesas and deep-shadowed canyons. The other 2 warriors, whose names she later learned were Tukume, Stands Alone, and Asa Nanika. Little Wolf rode with a silent, watchful vigilance, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Loretta, she had to stop thinking of herself, as Loretta was a prisoner of her own past. The name Lily Ann echoed in her head, unlocking fragments of memory that were both terrifying and achingly familiar. She remembered a gentle woman humming a song in a language she now recognized as Comanche. She remembered the rough, comforting hand of a man who taught her how to track rabbits. Her parents. But they weren't named Parker. They were the Dawsons. Dr. Thomas Dawson, and his wife, Marion. They had run a small mission and trading post on the edge of the Comanche, a place of peace between two worlds. She remembered Kowotsi. He was the son of a prominent war chief, and he had been her shadow, her only friend. They were inseparable, a strange pair, the pale, freckled girl with blonde hair and the fierce, dark-eyed Comanche boy. The carved meadowlark had been his gift to her on her 7th birthday. Then came the fire, the screams. Not Comanche warriors, she realized now with a chilling certainty. They were white men, renegade militia or bandits, their faces contorted with greed and whiskey. They had burned the mission to the ground, slaughtering her parents for a few crates of rifles and supplies. She had hidden where Kowotsi had shown her, in a hollow beneath the roots of an old cottonwood tree, and watched the horror unfold. He had found her later covered in soot and silent with shock, and had tried to lead her to his people. But they were separated in the chaos, and she was found days later by an army patrol, her mind wiped clean by the trauma. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a hoarse whisper against the wind. "Why now?" Tavibo slowed the horse to a walk, allowing it to drink from a small rock-fed stream. He turned his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the distance. "For 10 years I thought you were dead," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw the fire. I searched for you until the soldiers came. My father, his band, they were forced north away from this land. I stayed. I searched. I became a scout for the army, for the rangers. Anyone who would let me ride these hills, always listening, always looking for a ghost. He had been a ghost himself, living between worlds, shunned by some of his own people for working with the whites, distrusted by the soldiers he guided. A man on a singular, hopeless quest. I heard whispers," he continued. "A man named Higgins, a land baron in a new town called Redemption Gulch, was bringing in a mail-order bride from St. Louis. The description: blue eyes, hair the color of sun-dried grass. It was a fool's hope. I had followed 100 such hopes, and all led to dust. But I rode to see. When I saw you standing there, the ghost became flesh. You couldn't have just spoken to me." She asked, the absurdity of her own wedding's destruction washing over her. He turned to look at her then, and she saw the fierce, uncompromising world he lived in. "Spoken to you, and let that man put his hands on you. Let him claim you. You are the last piece of my past, Liliane. You are the only part of that world, the world before the fire that still breathes. I would have torn down that town brick by brick before I let him have you." His certainty was terrifying, and in a way she was ashamed to admit thrilling. No one had ever wanted her with such ferocious, all-consuming passion. She had been an orphan, a ward, a commodity to be purchased. To this man she was a memory, a mission, a part of his very soul. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice small. "To my people. What is left of them," he said grimly. "We are few now. We live in the hidden places, the canyons the white man is afraid to enter. It is not an easy life, but it is our life. It is your life, too. You are the daughter of the Dawsons, the friends of the Numunu. You carry their blood and our friendship within you." As they rode on, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Tukume and Esanani-ka set up a small, smokeless fire in the shelter of an overhanging rock. They offered her dried venison and water from a skin. It was tough and tasteless, but she ate her hunger, a raw, gnawing thing. She sat apart, watching the 3 men. They spoke in low, guttural tones, their language a flowing river of sounds she barely remembered. She was an outsider here too, a woman in a torn and dirt-stained wedding dress, sitting by a Comanche campfire. Later, as the stars blazed with an impossible brightness in the moonless sky, Tavibo came and sat near her. He didn't speak, just stared into the fire. "They will come for me," Lily-Ann said, breaking the silence. "Bart Higgins is not a man who forgives. He will see this as theft. He will hunt us." "I know," Tavibo said simply. "Let him come. He will be hunting a man who has been a shadow for 10 years. He is hunting in my church, and I know all the hymns." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You are afraid." "Of course I'm afraid." She snapped, the fear and confusion finally bubbling over into anger. "You kidnapped me from my own wedding. You dragged me into the desert. You tell me my entire life is a lie. I have a right to be afraid." He absorbed her anger without flinching. "It is right to be afraid," he agreed. "The world is a frightening place. But you were living a lie. Lily-Ann, you were marrying a man who bought you like a horse, a man who would have owned your body but never known your spirit. With me, you may be afraid, but you will be free, and you will be home." He laid a bedroll for her near the fire, a respectable distance from his own. She lay down the scratchy wool, a poor substitute for the fine linens she might have had in Bart Higgins's house. But as she stared up at the endless river of stars, a strange sense of peace began to settle over her. For the first time since she was a little girl, hiding under the roots of a cottonwood tree, she wasn't Loretta May Parker the orphan. She was Lily-Ann Dawson, and someone in the world knew her name. The journey stretched into days. They moved with a purpose that exhausted Lily-Ann to her core. Her body, accustomed to the soft life of a city ward, ached with a deep, penetrating fatigue. The fine leather shoes she was married in were shredded, and Tavibo had fashioned her a pair of crude moccasins from a spare piece of hide. Her beautiful white dress was ripped-stained and had become a symbol of a life that now seemed like a distant dream. Yet with every mile they traveled, the fog in her mind continued to lift. The Comanche words Tavibo spoke to his companions began to resonate with a faint, ghostly familiarity. She started to understand phrases, then simple sentences. The land itself seemed to speak to her. She recognized the scent of sagebrush after a rare rain, the cry of a hawk circling high above, the way the light fell in the late afternoon. These were not new experiences. They were buried ones, unearthed by the shock of her abduction. One evening, as they made camp in a narrow, winding canyon, Tavibo worked on the feathers of an arrow, his fingers deft and sure. Lily-Ann watched him, the firelight playing on the strong lines of his face. "Kawatsi," she said, the name feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. He froze his hands, stilling their work. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the boy he had been. The fierce warrior vanished for a moment, replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "You remember?" he whispered. It was not a question. "Bits and pieces," she admitted. "Like a shattered mirror. I see your face, but younger. I remember running through the trees. I remember my mother's song." She hummed a few bars of a simple, haunting melody. A slow smile spread across Tavibo's face, a rare and precious thing. She sang that when she worked in her garden. She said it made the corn grow sweeter. He put down his arrow and moved to sit across the fire from her. "Ask me," he said. "Ask me anything. I will be the thread that helps you stitch the pieces back together." And so she did. For hours under the silent watch of the canyon walls, she asked and he answered. He told her about her parents, not as saints, but as people. Her father Thomas, a man of God, but also a man of science who was fascinated by Comanche herbal remedies and treated their sick without judgment. Her mother Marian, who had taught the Comanche women how to cultivate new vegetables and had learned their beadwork in return, her fingers as skilled as any native woman's. He told her of his own father, Chief Pida, a great leader who saw the wisdom in peace with the white man, a stance that earned him both respect and enemies. Pida had trusted the Dawsons, and that trust had been the foundation of Lily Ann's idyllic childhood. "What happened to him, to your father?" she asked. The light in Tavibo's eyes dimmed. "After the raid, the world changed. The white men who killed your parents were never punished. The army called them unknown vigilantes. But other tribes, rivals of ours, used the attack to sow distrust. They said Pida's friendship with the whites had brought this evil upon us. The peace was broken. We were hounded by the army attacked by Apache and Ute. My father was killed 2 years later in a battle near the Cimarron River. Many of our people were lost." He fell silent, the weight of his history heavy in the air. "I was not there," he said, his voice laced with a bitter self-recrimination. "I was still searching for you, riding with the Texas Rangers, believing they would help me find justice. I was a fool." After his father's death, Tavibo had left the white man's world completely. He had gathered the scattered remnants of his father's band, a few families, old warriors, widows and orphans, and led them into hiding into the labyrinthine canyons of the high desert, where the army patrols wouldn't or couldn't follow. "For 10 years, he said, his gaze intense, we have survived. We have held to the old ways. But there were no women of marrying age. Sickness and battle took them. We were a people slowly dying out. I watched the children grow with no one to promise them a future. I saw the sadness in the eyes of the women who had lost their husbands and the men who had lost their wives. I had lost everything. I had no one to build a fire for. So I spent my time alone, scouting the edges of our land, keeping watch. That is why I told you. I hadn't seen a woman. I meant I hadn't seen a woman who could be a part of my life, a woman to be a wife. I had given up hope. I was a ghost in the canyon." Lily Ann finally understood the depth of his desperate act. It wasn't just about reclaiming a childhood friend. It was about reclaiming hope, not just for himself, but for his people. In her, he saw not just Lily Ann Dawson, but a future, a link to a past where peace was possible and a chance for a new generation to be born. The weight of that expectation was immense. She reached out and lightly touched the back of his hand. His skin was rough, but he didn't pull away. "You found me, Kowochi," she said softly, using his name with more confidence. "I did," he replied, his voice thick, "and I will not lose you again." Their conversation was interrupted by Sanan Ika, who appeared silently at the edge of the firelight. He spoke rapidly to Tavibo in Comanche. Tavibo's entire demeanor changed, the storyteller replaced instantly by the wary chief. "What is it?" Lily Ann asked. Tavibo stood his hand, going to the knife at his belt. "Riders. A day's journey behind us, maybe less. They ride hard. One of them knows how to track. He is not army." Lily Ann's blood ran cold. Bart Higgins. He hadn't just sent the sheriff. He had hired a professional. The world she had just left was now hunting her, and the fragile piece of her rediscovered past was about to be shattered by a man who refused to let his property go. The pace became relentless. They abandoned the lower canyons and climbed higher into the jagged heart of the mountains. The air grew thin and cold. The terrain was a nightmare of scree slopes and knife-edge ridges. Lily Ann was pushed beyond the limits of her endurance. but a new steely resolve had taken root in her. She was no longer just a victim being dragged along. She was one of them, and they were being hunted. Finally, after a grueling climb up a narrow, hidden trail that seemed to lead only to the sky, they came to a halt. Tukume let out a low, mournful bird call that echoed against the cliffs. An identical call answered from above. A moment later, a rope ladder snaked down the side of a sheer rock face. "Where are we?" Liliane breathed, staring up at the impossible cliff. "Home," Tavibo said simply. The Comanche camp was a miracle of concealment. It was nestled in a wide, bowl-like valley, invisible from below and protected on all sides by towering walls of red rock. A spring-fed waterfall, the hidden water, tumbled down one side, nourishing a small, lush meadow where a herd of ponies grazed. There were perhaps a dozen lodges or tipis scattered among the pinon pines. It was home to no more than 50 souls. Their arrival caused a stir. The people who emerged from the lodges were lean and weathered their eyes, holding a deep, abiding sadness, but also a fierce pride. They were survivors. They gathered around Tavibo, their faces a mixture of relief at his return and intense curiosity about the white woman in the tattered dress he brought with him. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, and her hair streaked with grey, pushed her way to the front. Her eyes were as sharp and intelligent as Tavibo's. She looked Liliane up and down, her gaze missing nothing. "You bring a white ghost into our sanctuary, my nephew?" she asked, her Comanche voice sharp and clear. "She is no ghost, Aunt Paku," Tavibo replied, his tone respectful, but firm. "She is Liliane Dawson, the daughter of Marion, who was your friend. The girl we thought was lost to the fire." A murmur went through the small crowd. The older ones remembered. They looked at Liliane with new eyes, searching her face for a resemblance to the kind woman who had traded with them long ago. Paku's expression softened, but only slightly. The years had taught her caution. "The past is a heavy stone," the old woman said cryptically. "It can build a house or drown a man. We will see which it is for you." The days that followed were a difficult rebirth for Liliane. She shed the last remnants of her old life. The ruined dress was burned, a symbolic act that felt both liberating and terrifying. Paku, who was the band's matriarch and spiritual guide, took her under her wing. Her tutelage was not gentle. Liliane was taught to scrape hides, to sew with an awl and sinew, to find edible roots, and to distinguish the call of a mountain lion from the whisper of the wind. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and capable. She learned the stories of the Numunu, the history of their creation and their heroes. She learned about the power of the eagle, the wisdom of the coyote, and the spirit that resided in all living things. It was a world away from the rigid pews and stern sermons of the orphanage chapel. Here God was not confined to a building. He was in the sigh of the wind, the cry of the hawk, the life-giving water of the falls. Her bond with Tavibo deepened, but it was a quiet, unspoken thing. They were not lovers in the way she had read about in books. Their connection was forged in shared memory and a mutual, desperate need for the future. He was their leader, burdened by the survival of his people, and she was his most important and most dangerous gamble. One evening, as the first chill of autumn began to creep into the high-altitude air, Paku summoned Liliane to her teepee. The old woman was seated by the fire, her hands busy weaving a small basket. "The man who hunts you draws closer," she said, without preamble. "Tuku may saw the smoke of his fire from the high ridge. It is too small for an army patrol. It is a tracker's fire." Liliane's heart clenched. What will we do?" "Tavibo prepares the warriors," Paku said. "But this is not just a fight of arrows and bullets. It is a fight of spirit. The man who bought you believes you belong to him. Our chief says you belong here. But what do you say, Lily Ann Dawson? Where does your spirit make its home?" It was the question she had been avoiding. Was she here by choice or by force? Had she simply traded one form of captivity for another? I am still learning," she admitted. "Then you must learn faster," the old woman said sternly. "Tomorrow night the moon will be full. You and my nephew will be bound. The old way." Lily Ann was stunned. Bound married. "A man and a woman who share a fire and a future must be bound," Paku stated as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He has declared you his wife. You have come with him. You have lived in his lodge. The ceremony will make it right in the eyes of the spirits. It will strengthen his claim. It will strengthen your place among us. It will give our people hope." Lily Ann's mind reeled. A Comanche wedding. It was a world away from the Christian ceremony Bart Higgins had tried to force on her. There would be no preacher, no white dress, only the ancient rites of a people clinging to existence. She looked at the old woman's wise, patient face. She thought of Tavibo's desperate act, of the decade he had spent searching for her, of the hope he had placed in her. She thought of the name, Lily Ann, a name he had kept alive like a sacred ember. She had a choice. She could remain a perpetual guest, an outsider, or she could become one of them truly and irrevocably. "I will do it," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My spirit makes its home here." A rare smile touched Paku's lips. "Good. A heart that knows its own mind is the strongest shield." The ceremony was simple and profound. It took place in the center of the camp, under the cold white light of the full moon. Lily Ann wore a simple buckskin dress, beautifully adorned with porcupine quills by the other women. Tavibo stood beside her, not as a conquering warrior, but as a man making a solemn vow. Paku officiated her voice, a low chant. She spoke of the two of them as two rivers flowing from different sources, but destined to join and become one stronger than either was alone. She bound their wrists together with a single strip of braided leather. There was no kiss. Instead, they shared a cup of water from the sacred spring and ate from the same piece of roasted venison, symbolizing their promise to sustain and provide for one another for all their days. As the leather was tied around her wrist, binding her to Tavibo, Lily Ann felt a profound sense of peace. This was not a contract of ownership. It was a promise of partnership. Looking at Tavibo's face, illuminated by the moonlight, she saw not her captor, but her husband, her destiny. But as the camp celebrated with quiet drumming and song, a lone figure watched them from a high distant ridge through a spyglass. He lay flat on his belly, a silhouette of pure malice against the starry sky. His name was Phineas Crow, and he was the best tracker in Texas, and he had just found exactly what Bart Higgins was paying him a fortune to find. Phineas Crow was a man carved from the meanest parts of the frontier. He was gaunt and wiry, with pale, colorless eyes that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. He didn't track men for justice or money, though he demanded plenty of the latter. He tracked them for the sheer predatory pleasure of the hunt and the final satisfying moment of capture. Bart Higgins had offered him a bounty that could set a man up for life, but it was the challenge that truly hooked him to hunt a Comanche chief on his own ground. For weeks, Crow had moved like a wraith through the land, while the sheriff's posse had given up and returned to Redemption Gulch with sun-blasted faces and empty canteens Crow had pressed on. He found tracks where others saw only bare rock. He read the meaning in a broken twig, a disturbed pebble. He was relentless patient and utterly without mercy. From his perch on the high ridge, he watched the Comanche ceremony through his brass spyglass. He saw the white woman in the native dress, her wrist being tied to the chief's. A cruel, thin-lipped smile touched his face. This was better than he could have hoped. Higgins had described the woman as a kidnapped victim, but what Crow saw was something far more complicated and far more useful. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a willing participant. "Got you," he whispered to the wind, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness. He didn't rush. Rushing was for fools. He spent 2 more days observing the hidden valley, learning its rhythms, its routines, its weaknesses. He noted the position of the sentries, the path to the spring, the location of the horse herd. He was a spider weaving his web, and the flies were still dancing unaware. He rode back to the prearranged meeting point, a desolate spot known as Traitor's Creek, where Bart Higgins waited with a dozen hired guns. These weren't town deputies. They were hard men, veterans of border wars and cattle feuds, men who would kill for a gold eagle and ask no questions. Higgins was pacing like a caged animal, his expensive suit coated in trail dust, his face a mask of frustration. "Well," he snarled as Crow rode into camp, "did you find him?" "I found him," Crow said, dismounting with a weary grace. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the fire. "And your blushing bride." Higgins's eyes lit up with a feverish glow. "Is she all right? Has he hurt her?" Crow took a slow sip of coffee, savoring the moment. "She's just fine, Mr. Higgins. In fact, she looked quite happy. Saw them get married Comanche style. She was wearing buckskin. Suited her, I think." The color drained from Higgins's face, replaced by a deep, blotchy red. The idea that his Loretta had not only survived, but embraced her captors, was an insult that cut deeper than the theft itself. It wasn't about her safety anymore. It was about his shattered pride. "Married," he choked out the word as if it were poison. That savage and... No, she's bewitched, brainwashed." "Call it what you like," Crow said, his voice flat. "Point is, she ain't coming back willingly. This is no longer a rescue mission, Mr. Higgins. It's an extermination. The deal's changed." "What do you mean the deal's changed?" Higgins blustered. "I mean my price for finding them is paid," Crow said, wiping his lips with the back of his hand. "My price for wiping out a whole camp of Comanche, including their chief, and bringing back a woman who doesn't want to come. Well, that's double. In advance." Higgins stared at the cold reptilian eyes of the tracker and knew he had no choice. He had come too far. His reputation in Redemption Gulch depended on this. He couldn't return empty-handed, a cuckold made a fool of by a single Indian. "Fine," he spat, unlocking a metal box and counting out a stack of gold coins that made the other hired gun's eyes widen. "Double, but I want him, Crow. I want that chief alive. I want to look him in the eye before I kill him myself. And the woman, I want her back, unharmed." "The chief is yours," Crow agreed, pocketing the gold. "As for the woman, in the heat of a battle, things happen. No guarantees." He gave Higgins a look that made it clear who was in charge. The plan Crow laid out was simple and brutal. They would not attack the camp head-on. The narrow approach was a death trap. Instead, he had identified the source of their life, the waterfall. The spring that fed it was a mile further up the mountain in a more accessible location. They would poison the spring. "Poisoned or," one of the gunmen, a man named Frank, shifted uncomfortably. "That ain't a clean way to fight." "We ain't here to fight clean," Crow sneered. "We're here to win. We'll use just enough strychnine. It won't kill them outright, not right away. It'll make them sick, violently ill, cramps, confusion. While they're weak and tending to their children, we attack from above. It'll be a turkey shoot." The sheer cold-blooded cruelty of the plan settled over the camp. Bart Higgins, for all his bluster, looked pale. This was far from the heroic rescue he had imagined. But he was in too deep. His hatred for Tavibo and his obsession with reclaiming Lily-Ann overrode any flicker of conscience. "Do it," Higgins said, his voice a low growl. Under the cover of a moonless night, Crow and two of his quietest men made their way up the mountain. They found the spring a placid pool bubbling up from the earth. Crow unstoppered a large vial of white powder and poured it into the water, watching as the crystalline poison dissolved and was carried downstream towards the hidden valley, where the Numunu slept, dreaming of a future that had already been stolen from them. The sickness began subtly. A child crying in the night with stomach pains, an old man collapsing while tending the horses. By midday, a dozen people were afflicted, retching and shaking with fever. Panic began to spread through the small community. They suspected bad water, but they couldn't know the malevolent human hand behind it. Lily-Ann, remembering her father's medical training, worked tirelessly alongside Parku brewing willow bark tea to fight the fever and trying to keep the victims hydrated. She saw the terror in the eyes of a mother whose baby was convulsing and her heart filled with a cold, righteous fury. Tavibo knew this was no natural illness. It was too sudden, too widespread. It was an attack. He ordered the healthy warriors, now only a handful, to the camp's defenses. He sent Tukume, his fastest runner, on a desperate mission to a neighboring band of Jicarilla Apache old rivals, but perhaps willing to help against a common enemy. It was a long shot. "They're coming," Tavibo said to Lily-Ann, his face grim as he checked his rifle. "They weakened us first. They will attack soon." "What can I do?" she asked, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Stay with Parku. Keep the children safe," he ordered. "No." She said, a fire in her eyes he had never seen before. "I am not a child to be hidden. My father didn't just teach me about healing herbs. He taught me how to shoot. He said a woman on the frontier should know how to defend her home." Tavibo stared at her, seeing not the pale, frightened girl from Redemption Gulch, but a true daughter of the Numunu, her spirit forged in the fires of this new life. He nodded slowly and handed her a small, lightweight rifle. "Stay in the rocks above the main path. Fire only when you are sure of your shot. Make them count." The attack came at dusk. Phineas Crow and his men used ropes to descend the cliffs on the far side of the valley, just as he had planned. Bart Higgins, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, was among them. They opened fire on the village below, their bullets ripping through the thin tipi hides. Tavibo and his warriors returned fire from behind rocks, but they were outnumbered, and many of them were already weakened by the poison. The battle was a chaotic, desperate affair. Lily-Ann found her position, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw the flashes of the attackers' rifles from the cliffs opposite. She rested her barrel on a rock, took a deep breath, as her father had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. One of the figures on the cliff cried out and fell. A surge of grim satisfaction went through her. She was defending her home. Down below, Bart Higgins saw Tavibo directing the defense and was consumed by a blinding rage. "He's mine, Crow!" He screamed over the gunfire and began scrambling down the rocks towards the village floor, heedless of the danger. Crow, meanwhile, wasn't interested in the main fight. He was a hunter. He slipped away from the firefight, circling around through the trees, his eyes searching for his true prize, the chief. He found Tavibo, pinned down behind a large boulder, trading shots with two of Higgins's men. Crow raised his rifle, taking careful aim at Tavibo's exposed back. This was his moment. But he hadn't counted on Lily-Ann. From her vantage point, she saw the lone figure creeping through the shadows. She recognized the gaunt frame and predatory stillness of a professional killer. She saw him raise his rifle, aiming directly at her husband. She didn't have time to reload. There was only one other weapon at her side, a simple bow and a quiver of arrows that Tavibo had been teaching her to use. Her skill was rudimentary at best. It was an impossible shot over 100 yards in the fading light. She didn't think. She acted. She drew an arrow, pulled the bowstring back until it bit into her fingers, and loosed the shaft in a high, desperate arc. The arrow flew a silent prayer against the noisy backdrop of the battle. Crow focused entirely on his target, never saw it coming. The arrow plunged into his shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of shock and pain. His shot went wild, embedding itself harmlessly in the dirt. Tavibo, alerted by the cry, whirled around and saw Crow clutching the arrow. In that split second of distraction, he fired his rifle. The bullet struck Crow square in the chest, ending the tracker's hunt for good. At the same moment, Bart Higgins finally reached the valley floor, his pistol drawn. He saw Tavibo standing over Crow's body and charged his face a mask of primal hatred. You stole her from me." Tavibo turned to face him, his rifle empty. Higgins raised his pistol, a triumphant sneer on his face. "She was never yours to steal," Tavibo said, standing his ground, ready to die. But before Higgins could fire, a figure flew at him from the side. It was Lily-Ann. She had scrambled down from the rocks, her rifle discarded, her face streaked with soot and fury. She crashed into Higgins, knocking his arm and spoiling his aim. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet whining past Tavibo's head. They tumbled to the ground. Higgins, enraged, backhanded her across the face. "You ungrateful whore, I'll teach you." He never finished the sentence. Tavibo was on him in an instant, the fury of a man defending his entire world in his eyes. It wasn't a fight, it was a judgment. When it was over, Bart Higgins lay still on the ground he had tried to conquer. Seeing their leader and their tracker fall, the remaining hired guns lost their nerve. They scrambled back up their ropes and fled into the night. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the weeping of the sick. Tavibo rushed to Lily-Ann's side, helping her up. He gently touched the bruise already forming on her cheek. "You saved my life," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You gave me my life back," she replied, leaning against him, the strength finally draining from her limbs. "We saved each other." In the aftermath, Tukume returned not alone, but with a dozen Apache warriors. They were too late for the fight, but their presence was a powerful statement. They helped tend to the wounded and secure the valley. An alliance born from a common threat had been forged. The future for the people of the Hidden Water was still uncertain. They were a small band in a changing world. But they were not broken. They had faced down the darkness and survived. As Lily-Ann stood with Tavibo, watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls with promise, she knew she was home. She was not the mail-order bride Loretta, nor the traumatized orphan. She was Lily-Ann, wife of Kowotse, a woman of two worlds who had fought for and found her place in the heart of the Wild West. And so, the story of Lily-Ann and Tavibo comes to a close. It's a tale that reminds us that sometimes the life we're supposed to live is buried deep beneath the life we are told to accept. It's a testament to a love that crossed worlds, survived a decade of silence, and was powerful enough to forge a new future from the ashes of the past. Their story isn't written in any official history books. It lives on only in the whisper of the wind through the high canyons, a forgotten chapter of the American West. What do you think was Tavibo's desperate act justified? What would you have done in Lily-Ann's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. These incredible untold stories are why we do what we do. If you were captivated by this journey, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a great story, and most importantly, subscribing to our channel for more true tales from the untamed frontier. Thank you for listening.